While I was looking up information on the Sega Genesis wrestling games, I stumbled across something kind of interesting to me. I was expecting to see the 3 LJN games that were published on the Super Nintendo, but instead I found that they were published by this company called Flying Edge. Back up a little bit, most people know who LJN is by now, especially if you are a video game collector or if you're kind of into video game history. They started out as a toy manufacturer, and they had the rights to several licensed products, like the WWF. They also had some of the Marvel stuff as well. And then they eventually got into video games, were purchased by Acclaim, and their toy department got shut down, and they were just basically a publisher. Acclaim used them as a way to publish more games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and as I mentioned, I was expecting to see them on the Sega Genesis, but instead, it's this company called Flying Edge. And I was a little interested in it, so I decided to try to look up more information on that company. Looking up information on Flying Edge is kind of a pain in the butt. They just sort of redirect to Acclaim now, so trying to find any history on them is very difficult. It isn't like LJN, where they had this track record of putting out products prior to being purchased by Acclaim, and they don't really have any history prior to being created by Acclaim. And that's pretty much where we start off with. They were created by Acclaim in order to publish more video games. It seems that Acclaim only used Flying Edge when they were publishing on Sega hardware. So you'll find Flying Edge on the Master System, on the Sega Genesis, and on the Game Gear. It's very interesting to see that, and it kind of raised a few questions as to why Acclaim didn't just use the LJN label, and instead they created this new label in order to publish on a competitor to Nintendo. So why did they use Flying Edge? It comes down basically to Nintendo and Sega's licensing agreements. Nintendo had a licensing agreement where the games that you published on their system were exclusive to that system for 2 years. So LJN would be locked into Nintendo's environment, for lack of a better word, for 2 years. This meant that Acclaim couldn't use that label to publish on Sega, so they created Flying Edge in order to get around that. Or at least that's my reading of this situation. A lot of people talk about, or at least a lot of people who have done histories of kind of the console wars, will talk about how Nintendo limited the number of games that you could publish on their system to 5 a year. What isn't mentioned is Sega had a very similar system set up. You don't really hear too much about it, and I haven't seen a whole lot of people talk about it outside of a few books that mention how Electronic Arts was able to get around this by reverse engineering the Sega Genesis and then sort of using that to get a better deal to publish games and also manufacture their own games as well. There's a similar situation to what EA did with Acclaim, where they also reverse engineered the Sega Genesis, but they did not sign an exclusivity deal with Sega, so they were basically an unlicensed publisher. Acclaim didn't do any of that, but it is still a very interesting story. Acclaim went kind of within the framework of both Sega and Nintendo, and in order to get around the limits that they had in order to publish games, they created these subsidiaries, like LJN and Flying Edge. All of that was just a very long explanation to say they were a publisher, they didn't make any of these games, and they share a lot of similarities to how LJN would work as well, where they would just publish a bunch of stuff, and they didn't actually create anything, but later on they would get blamed for a lot of the products that were put out with their name on it. There were a lot of similarities between LJN and Flying Edge, but there were also quite a few differences, as they didn't have as much overlap between their two catalogs of games that they would publish. So let's talk about that a little bit. They use basically the same list of developers, and these were probably selected by Acclaim. So you have Ocean, Arc Development, Software Creations, Beam Software, Grey Matter Inc., Audiogenic, Sculptured Software, Bit Studios, and Park Place Productions. These are just the ones that I could find based off the lists of the different developers that these two companies have worked with. There could be a lot more out there because there is not a very good list of games for Flying Edge out there. It's weird, to be honest with you. Depending on the source that you look at, or if you have somebody who owns every Sega Genesis game, you'll probably get a much clearer picture if that happens. But just looking at the different lists, it looked like Flying Edge published somewhere between 13 and 19 games on the Sega Genesis. I didn't look at the Master System or Game Gear games that closely, because there's still a lot of overlap between what was on the console and then on the handhelds or on the previous console as well. There's just a lot of overlap between them, which makes an awful lot of sense. So just looking at the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis games, there's not as much overlap as I was expecting between LJN and Flying Edge. There's still quite a bit, though. They published 7 of the same games, but I was honestly expecting a lot more than that. It's kind of cool when you go back and you look at these things to see what Acclaim thought would work for one system, or what work they put into one system versus the other one. It's kind of odd. Flying Edge also had quite a few games that I think are really great that they published. Stuff like Steel Empire in particular I think is awesome. And it's kind of odd when you think, oh, okay, Acclaim had the rights to this, and they only published it on one system instead of publishing it on both. Given how many licensed products the two companies published, it was kind of surprising that it was only 7, though. So you have have 2 of the 3 WWF games, you've got some Spider-Man games, you have Terminator 2, Incredible Crash Test Dummies, and then a couple of one-off sports games. It makes sense because that's sort of what LJN published. They would publish a bunch of licensed stuff. And Flying Edge didn't publish as much, but they still published quite a bit when you look at their library. The story of Flying Edge is short and pretty murky. There isn't much mystery as to why they were created, but there is quite a bit of a mystery as to who really worked there. I would have liked to have had a list of people who worked at this company or created it or something like that. Unfortunately, that seems to just sort of be lost at the moment. I can only guess that the employees were from Acclaim. That would make sense, but I can't really find anything to support it. Flying Edge was only around from 92 to 94, and then they got shut down, much like how LJN was. I'm sorry I have to kind of leave things like this, because there just isn't that much more information about it. It was just a short-lived company that was designed to publish more games on Sega hardware. When I eventually take a longer look at Acclaim, maybe Flying Edge will come back up, but they're, at the moment, just kind of an interesting footnote in Acclaim's history, and I don't think they would even deserve a mention in video game history outside of me being really curious and falling down a rabbit hole for a little bit. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you even knew that Flying Edge existed. I'll talk to you later. Bye.